I want to start my presentation about the topic of obesity in the United States by showing the difference between being overweight and being obese. The World Health Organization defines being overweight and obese as abnormal or excessive fat accumulation that presents a risk to health. In an article titled Global, Regional, and National Prevalence of Overweight and Obesity in Children and Adults, they said that worldwide obesity has more than doubled since the year 1980, and most of the world's population now live in countries where overweight and obesity kills more people than underweight disease do. Here is a graph that I found from the NCD Risk Factor Collaboration Projections, and it shows the obesity rate rising throughout the years, and then it also shows a projected time period. According to Collier in his article, United States obesity rates continue to rise. He said that in total, 72.5 million Americans are obese, which is equal to 26.7% of the population. In 2009, obesity rates exceeded 30% in 9 different states. Now, in 2007, there were only 3 states that reached this high percentage. One thing that I would also like to include about this data that I just talked about is that it is self-reported and it was done over the phone, so it's likely that they didn't receive every single obese person in these states. Although obesity is prevalent in many areas of the world, my presentation and the research that I've looked at has focused on obesity within the United States. It's because it's definitely no secret that the United States has an extremely high obesity rate compared to other countries. As a matter of fact, a biomedical research center in Louisiana says that obesity prevalence in the United States is on track to reach approximately 42% of the population by the year 2030. The first article that I'm going to be talking about was by Medical News Today. I found this one to be the most reliable and credible. I think that they laid obesity out in a very factual way. And they started off by defining what obesity was and talking about the body mass index and the differentiations like I have talked about previously in the presentation. I think that this is really important for an article to do because sometimes the audience will go into the article not knowing much about the topic, and they could be possibly biased by the lingo or by the information that the media is portraying, and it may not be accurate information. I did find that the Medical News Today had all accurate information, and it was backed up by all the scholarly research that I read. They also gave 7 different common causes for obesity, and I'll list them out. It were things like consuming too many calories, an extended period of being overweight, which makes it hard for the weight to come off, things like endocrine disruptors, lack of sleep, sedentary lifestyle, and I think that it's important for the audience to be able to read what those common causes are because it may be things that they do. Here are a couple clips showing how the article was medically reviewed by a licensed dietitian and nutritionist, and they also stated that any medical information published on this site isn't intended for expert medical advice, which I think is very important. The CNN Health article that I found was the least credible. It started off with a title that says half of America will be obese within 10 years, which we know based off of the scholarly research that I found that isn't true. And although 42% is quite close to half of America, it isn't half America, and I recognize this claim to be exaggerated. And the CNN article then went on to say that over half of America will be obese, which is even more inaccurate than the headline that they used. So I think that they were definitely using language to try and frame the obesity crisis in a way to create a little bit more panic in the audience, and that really just that knocks down the credibility of their news article because it's inaccurate and it's quite a bit exaggerated. Although at the beginning of the article they did display some inaccurate information, they did start to say some interesting things that were accurate by discussing the low income and poverty effects on obesity. I think this topic was important important to bring up because not many of the other news articles talked about it. And the low income and poverty problem has been huge on obesity. They aren't able to afford healthy choices. They don't have time to meal plan. They have to go to fast food restaurants, and they have much more limited physical activity options that make it hard for people that suffer with obesity. At the end of the article, they also mentioned some possible solutions to obesity, which I think is great for anybody that's reading the article and possibly suffering obesity. The final article that I'll be discussing was an NBC News article. I found this source to be the second most credible out of the three that I've discussed so far. This one began with a statement that almost half of U.S. adults will be considered obese by 2030, which is much more accurate information based on the study that I referenced previously. This article also discussed how women are more vulnerable to obesity than men, which is true, only by 4%, but they still are more vulnerable than men. And it also said that African Americans are more vulnerable. The article also talked about the different diseases that are linked to obesity, such as heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and a dozen types of cancer. And they also inserted an excerpt from the American Cancer Association to show their credibility for how obesity can be linked to types of cancer. The article was consistent with scholarly research that I found, and even talked about how obesity is much more prevalent than in the South than any other region. I think that each of these articles did have quite a bit of accuracy to each of them, but I do feel that they were ranked a little bit different in credibility, with the Medical News Today being most credible, NBC News being second credible, and the CNN Health being least credible, but still having accurate information.